The Minotaur by Ted Hughes. The mahogany tabletop you smashed had been the broad plank top of my mother's heirloom sideboard, mapped with the scars of my whole life. That came under the hammer, the high stool you swung that day, demented by my being, 20 minutes late for baby minding. Marvellous, I shouted. Go on, smash it into kindling. That's the stuff you're keeping out of your poems. And later, considered and calmer. Get that shoulder under your stanzas and we'll be away. Deep in the cave of your ear, the goblin snapped his fingers. So what had I given him? The bloody end of the skein that unravelled your marriage, left your children echoing like tunnels in a labyrinth, left your mother a dead end, brought you to the horn-bellowing grave of your risen father, and your own corpse in it. Okay, so the way I'll be approaching this poem is a bit different from usual. I will be treating the analysis, the short-term analysis, into two parts. So I'll be dissecting it. So the first three stanzas here, and I'll describe the links between them. And then I'll do the next section on the last three stanzas. So splitting up the closer analysis into two parts. And then instead of looking at the broader themes, I will be journeying through an exploration of the Minotaur, the representation of the Minotaur, the myth, and Mythopia, or Mythopia. So, in fact, in my closer analysis, I will just be doing the surface reading and the story of the poem, and then only in that later section will I fully explore the role of the Minotaur. So hold on, because it does get better. But yes, I will reveal the significance of the title in the second part of the video. So, for the first three stanzas, these really outline the story of the poem, and then the final three stanzas go a little bit into the metaphor of the poem. So, in which case, we can kind of ignore the title for now, but on surface reading, this is a poem about Plath's tendency to exaggerate and sort of overreact to the severity of suffering. And in its simplest terms, this poem's sort of a passage of domestic violence in the Hughes-Plath household. It's really just a sort of nuptial dispute, as it were. Now, the poem is split up into 6 quatrains, so it's very regular in form, and the function of this, I believe, is to reflect the sort of regular routine and domesticity of a household, or which will later develop into an argument here. So immediately we have, remember, it's part of his anthology, The Birthday Letters. So in most cases, it's a direct addressal to Plath, which it is. The mahogany tabletop you smashed. Already we've got a very accusatory tone, a blameful tone in the poem. I guess you could pick up on the onomatopoeic quality of smashed as well. And it later comes down here. And in this instance, it's used in a more provocative sense. But again, I'll return to that later. And actually, the accusatory you appears and reappears in the poem a lot. So I'm actually going to signal it by highlighting it and then go through some of the other key examples of you in the poem. I know they're not quite sections we've done yet, but it comes up a lot. Probably missed a few. And particularly near the end, you can tell the deliberacy with which Hughes is using these pronouns. I mean, look, just successively in these lines, your, you, and etc. So, yeah, back up here though. This first stanza is basically saying that Plath smashed a table, mahogany tabletop, which had been the broad plank of Hughes's mother's heirloom. So there's this family connection here, but mapped with the scars of his whole life. So there's perhaps a more sinister undertone or overtone to this image. There are many scars in Hughes' life, so it's very hard to determine which one Hughes is referring to in particular in this instance, sorry. But yes, the point is it's not just the surface reading, no pun intended, is a broad plank top of a table, but the undertone or reading is the scars of his life. That came under the hammer, the high stool you swung. We've got this idea of motion coming in a lot. This theme which makes the poem more vivid. The high stool you swung that day, demented by my being, 20 minutes late for baby minding. Now, the way I read that, demented by my being, 20 minutes late for baby minding, that is deliberate enjambment and isolation of the word being, because demented by my being would suggest that Plath is sort of really overtaken, annoyed at Hughes's presence. But then, 20 minutes late. So Plath's actually annoyed at the fact that Hughes is 20 minutes late for baby minding. So it's Hughes's existence that is the problem here. And I mean, Hughes ultimately was one of the big causes for Plath's suicide, but it's evident that Hughes is hinting at Plath, perhaps a more unstable, rocky marriage going on between them, which certainly isn't a new idea in the birthday letters. And then just returning to the stool here, this is quite a basic object, an item of furniture, but Hughes really brings it out as an instrument of anger. So the Hughes is representative of Plath's anger, and then expanding on that, this anger is seen as her inspiration. Inspiration for what, James? Third stanza, inspiration for poetry. Inspiration for poetry. Because Hughes then says, "Marvellous," I shouted. "Go on, smash it into kindling. That's the stuff you're keeping out of your poems." Basically, all this anger, all this emotion is what Plath doesn't have in her poems, which is far from the truth if you've read anything like Daddy. And actually, Hughes's use of direct speech here is important because really direct speech is a poetical device used to vent honest feelings. And so Hughes has already used this in keeping with the idea of an argument. And again, we picked up on this smash into kindling, like a burning flame, a fire. That's the stuff you're keeping out of your poems. So Hughes is actually, this argument is going beyond a nuptial dispute, one that belongs in a marriage, to her career. Which, both of them being poets, is quite an important thing. And then it says, and later considered in calmer. This is what Hughes is going to say onto the next bit. And actually, the start of this is sort of a continuation of the argument, but then it goes into some sort of deeper ideas here. So yes, that's the surface reading of the first section. I hope that's been helpful. The second section is a bit more packed in terms of its imagery and really its allusions to the title. So it's going to be quite hard to avoid the bigger myth that I will be exploring in the deeper analysis. However, I'm going to try my best just to do another surface reading, closer analysis. So we've just had Hughes's argument continued slightly calmer, saying get that shoulder, even though this is still very imperative. So it can't be that much sort of calmer, it can't be that tonally, it's still argumentative. Get that shoulder under your stanzas and we'll be away. Your stanzas will. Now this is interesting because of course he's referring to Plath's poetry here, but Hughes is using an inclusive third person, first person plural pronoun, first person. And this is because Hughes in his birthday letters and in general really saw Plath's poems as a joint enterprise. So Hughes, rightly or wrongly, I'd probably say wrongly, believed that he was as responsible for her poetry as she was, being the author. He viewed himself as a sort of muse to Plath's poetry, and Plath actually has commented on Hughes's inspiration in letters that have been uncovered, and also as a sort of quasi-parental figure to the works of Plath. So Hughes is almost taking ownership of Plath's poetry here, which is an interesting insight. Anyway, so you're in the middle of the line and stop in the middle of the line. Deep in the cave of your ear. Now, a cave is typically a shelter, and usually from harm or entrapment, which is quite ironic given the theme of the labyrinth that comes later. But yes, it's usually seen as a shelter, a latibule, a hiding place. But also in this case, the cave, I believe, is Plath's conscience personified. It is the sort of areas of Plath's conscience, sorry for repetition, that goes beyond Hughes's perception or cognition. And the ear, the focus of hearing, which is very important, and then this snapping of a finger, or the goblin's fingers. Now, the goblin here is really a sort of fantastical personification of anger. And also, the goblin reflects something else, which I'm deliberately ignoring for now, but I will come back to later. So yes, the goblin snapped his fingers, and then Hughes asks this question. So what had I given him? And we already know the goblin's a him. Again, I will return to this later. But yeah, Hughes answers this question in the next two stanzas. So what had I given him? What had I given the goblin? He says, the bloody end of the skein, that unravelled your marriage left your children echoing like tunnels in a labyrinth. Now, this is still Plath the yaw, to avoid confusion. But we've got the idea of, if you've noticed, we've got very much present tense coming on here. Smashed into king, that stuff you are keeping out. Will be away, all this stuff. But then suddenly we've got this past tense. And what the past tense is doing, I think, is that it's sort of slowing down the pace, slowing down the speed, and it's saying that this unravelling of your marriage, or their marriage rather, is somewhat slow and almost tedious. But yeah, the use of your marriage, which is a very interesting term, given that Hughes is indeed married to Plath. So he is referring to our marriage, his and Plath's marriage, it suggests a dissociation. Your children, Hughes, they're your children too. Echoing like tunnels in labyrinth. The idea of echoing, that sort of, that imprint, that continuity again, of earlier, all the way from here, that sort of aural quality of your ear, echoing that imprint in his mind. Like tunnels in a labyrinth. Now, if the skein, which was referenced earlier, which is a reference to the myth, I will go back to that, and equally the labyrinth, a very obvious reference if we haven't already got it to the myth. But the labyrinth, I also think, can be a sort of embodiment of Plath's own psychological state, or, as I'm going to phrase it here, her psychological entanglement, just like the skein in the labyrinth. And also this focus on the word left, which is placed emphatically at the start of these lines and repeated, which is a reference to her children and her mother, leaving her children and her mother. Now, Plath left her children alone after her suicide. So her suicide left them alone. And this idea of leaving, this sort of pushing on of her children, but also this idea that her children are going to be scarred. A reference earlier, a word that Hughes uses here. Where is it? Mapped with scars of my whole life. So the children are, of course, going to be scarred by the fact that their mother has killed herself. And this idea that it's quite cyclical. Plath's own grief is then being continued to the children in this bit, and the children being left here again. And finally, this idea, there's quite a lot from these words, from the word left, of sacrifice. Now, I am going to have to disclose some of it now. Basically, the Minotaur children were sacrificed to the Minotaur. People were sacrificed to the Minotaur. So is this a reference Plath is making of her own children were sacrificed to a Minotaur? But anyway, yes, I won't go into that too much for now. So this is what we've got for that stanza there. And then finally, and probably the most striking stanza, my favourite stanza of the poem so far, is left your mother a dead end, brought you to the horned, bellowing grave of your risen father, and your own corpse in it. Now the dead end here, slightly ambiguous, but it could refer to the fact that either sort of the mother was unable to carry on or to continue the relationships in her family after Plath's death, or is it a reference to the fact that her mother was literally dead? So there's that interesting sort of ambiguity on that phrase. And then brought you to the horned, bellowing grave, the horned reference to the Minotaur here. And if you hadn't already picked up on the trope of death, the theme of death here, the corpse, the grave of your risen father. Risen father is somewhat supernatural. And her father was a man called Otto Plath, who I will visit later, definitely. And finally, your own corpse in it. This cyclical nature again. Now it's Plath. Plath killed herself. So that's it. That's my close analysis of the Minotaur here. And yes, now I'm going to delve deeper into the myth itself. So as promised, here it is. So the story of the Minotaur, let's start off with that. So the story of the Minotaur is a classical story. And the Minotaur is a monster with the head of a bull and the body of a man. The Minotaur was imprisoned in a dark underground labyrinth, which will come up a lot in this analysis, at Knossos on the Greek island of Crete. Okay, the building of the labyrinth, which is sort of a big maze, was commissioned by King Minos and designed by Daedalus, but that really isn't too important at this point. What we do need to know is that there was this man, let's just note down King Minos, but there was this man called Theseus, and he was the questor, if you like. He was the one who journeyed to navigate the labyrinth with the help of Ariadne's thread. And the whole purpose of this quest was to try and save the people from the ritual sacrifice to the Minotaur. I can't quite remember the number of people or the period of sacrifice, but basically the people, the islanders, had to sacrifice themselves ritually to this Minotaur. So Theseus wanted to put a stop to it, which he did successfully. And using Ariadne's thread to sort of navigate his way around the labyrinth. So that is the myth, of the Minotaur. Now I'm going to look at Hughes's personal relationship with this myth. So Hughes himself studied anthropology and archaeology at Cambridge University. So he had this university background, an in-depth study that then provoked his special interest in myth and legend. And as Dr. Andrew Armitage said, this poem is an exercise in Hughes's mythopoeic mode. Now I've used mythopoeia, but in the title here, but what exactly does it mean? And yes, this is credit to Armitage, by the way, Dr. Andrew Armitage, in his The Birthday Letters Myth, which I thoroughly recommend reading, a very good thesis. So yes, what is mythopoeia? Now mythopoeia is a narrative genre in fiction. So it's a type of genre where the writer creates either an original or a sort of, or builds on a mythology, which Hughes does here. He builds on the classical allusion to the Minotaur. So yes, not quite original, but he does twist a lot of it. And I'm going to talk about Hughes's very interesting reversals in this myth. So Hughes's reversals really begin in the characterization of the myth. So what I mean by that is Hughes himself is represented by Ariadne. Now Ariadne is typically the iconic figure of sort of female abandonment, or of an abandoned woman. Who does this ring true more of than Hughes Plath? Obviously this is deliberate irony. And then Plath herself in this poem is represented as the Questor, Theseus, who is actually a notorious adulterer. So who does that sound more like? Hughes. So we've got this very nice crossover here. And then, so in terms of the characterization here, we've got the idea of Hughes spinning the string, and Plath being left into the maze's centre. And then I said I'd go back to Otto Plath, who is her father. Now Otto Plath was really Plath's poetic inspiration. Not the poetic inspiration, as I mentioned earlier, Hughes was at one point, but one of her poetic inspirations. And we see Otto, many critics argue, in this poem as the Minotaur himself. So many people argue that the Minotaur is either Plath, Sylvia Plath, or it's Otto. And I think it's Otto because of his link to the inspiration for Plath. Now actually, this goblin that I was saying is Otto, is Plath's father, because he is embedded in her mind. He's her inspiration, and he's this personification of anger as well. Plath felt a lot of anger towards her father. So what had I given him? What had I given Otto Plath? So there we are, probably something that wasn't noticeable on first reading, or certainly not for me, anyway. And then, in terms of these reversals, these reversals don't expand beyond the character, also to the skein. Now, the skein itself is golden in the myth, but in this story, the skein is described as bloody. Where is it? Yes, the bloody end of the skein, which is an obvious reversal, a twist. And then actually, we've got the idea of the direction of the skein. So instead of the skein supposed to be leading Theseus out, or Plath, out of the maze's centre, it actually leads her into the maze's centre, very controversially, which is where she then finds her death at the end, and your own corpse in it. So this was obviously not how it was originally intended. Now, I must admit, these the spottings of these reversals, which are very fascinating, aren't originally mine. So I give sort of responsibility to critic Hyman, who wrote this in her study of Ted Hughes' birthday letters, which again, I would recommend. Very comprehensive study. In her chapter 2 on mythology. It's available online. That's critic Hyman. So yes, as well as these reversals, we can also do some more surface digging into the idea of mythopia, because Hughes references the story of the Minotaur in lots of his other poems. I'm going to pick out 2 examples, though there are many more. Again, Hyman explores this. But really, you've got, in his poem that he wrote called Your Paris, which was a poem about Plath's visions of Paris. It was sort of written about her. Again, it's in the birthday letters. And Plath kind of wrote a humorous comeback to that called Your Paris as well, about Hughes. But basically, Hughes makes a reference to the Minotaur and the Labyrinth. And then also, as well, another birthday letters poem, Setebos, which is referenced like a deity worshipped by a Shakespearean witch, but also moon. And that Hughes sort of references their relationship as a labyrinth. And also, very interestingly, Hughes himself doesn't have time in the end to kill the Minotaur in this poem before it finds and kills Plath. Yeah, so that is perhaps a very interesting insight, without needing to state the obvious, into their relationship. Now, why have I made these references to the appearance of the Labyrinth and Minotaur again in these poems? Well, because I think the Labyrinth represents more than just the classical maze. And by this, I mean the Labyrinth can be a representation of fate. The gradual uncertainty and the gradual process and journey through this labyrinth, as shown by the use of sort of unravelled, referring to the string, but also just the journey through full of dead ends, is perhaps this idea of the slow unravelling of fate, sort of what is destined to happen to Plath, which is her own suicide or her or the death of others around her. You've also got this idea of a quest, a mission. Is it the mission, with Hughes' sort of rather sexist reference to the roles who's supposed to be baby minding here, of baby minding? Is it the mission of being a good mother, or not, rather, down here? Or is it an imprisonment? I know I made a reference earlier to the cave, sorry to keep flipping around, which is the idea of a protection from imprisonment, but actually, could this labyrinth be a prison that Plath could not get out of? Or is it this idea of their relationship? Or is it even Plath's own mind, which I mentioned earlier, that sort of psychological entanglement that she has? So the labyrinth could reflect a lot, and therefore it's a very important image. And again, it's not just for this poem. In fact, it's used in many more of Hughes' poems, as well as these. And really, that covers all of what I wanted to say in reference to Hughes' classical allusions and the idea of mythopia. So I hope that's been an interesting exploration, and upon second reading of the poem, hopefully that will uncover a lot more into its deeper meaning. Thank you very much for watching